Silence swallowed the room whole when the doctors declared that the newborn son of Chicago's most feared mafia boss had stopped breathing. Vincent Corsetti, the man who had made entire criminal empires kneel before him, collapsed to his knees beside the tiny, lifeless body. His hands, the same hands that had signed countless death warrants, now trembled helplessly against his son's cold skin. All the wealth he had accumulated, all the power he had seized, all the blood he had spilled to build his empire meant nothing in that sterile white room. His guns could not threaten death into retreating. His money could not bribe fate into mercy. Everything he had waited for, everything his late wife had died giving him, had slipped away in a single flat line. But just when despair had consumed every corner of that room, a woman stepped through the door. She was frail, her clothes worn from years of poverty, her face pale from a heart condition she could not afford to treat. She was nobody, just a night shift janitor who had taught herself medicine by watching doctors and reading discarded textbooks. All she had was a tattered notebook filled with desperate scribbles and a promise she had made to her dying twin brother 15 years ago. She did what no specialist in that room had dared to attempt, what every expert had already given up on. And what happened next was something no doctor could ever explain. But here is what she did not know. The man whose son she was about to save was the same man who had ordered her family's execution 15 years earlier. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Because some stories do not just entertain, they change how we see the world. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to understand how a woman with nothing became the only one who could save everything for a man who had taken everything from her. 15 years ago, on a winter night so cold it cut through skin and bone in the suburbs of Chicago, 12-year-old Serena Hayes was sitting at the dining table with her family. Her father, Michael Hayes, was an ordinary accountant working for a small transportation company. Her mother, Eleanor, was carrying a bowl of hot soup from the kitchen, while Samuel, Serena's twin brother, was fighting her for the last cookie. The small house was warm. Laughter filled the air, and none of them knew that this would be the last dinner they would ever share together. At exactly 8:45 in the evening, the front door was kicked open. Men dressed in black stormed inside, their faces hidden behind masks, guns in their hands as cold as their eyes. Michael sprang to his feet, a father's instinct driving him toward his wife and children. He didn't even have time to say a single word before the gunshot rang out. Serena saw her father fall, blood spreading across the wooden floor he himself had varnished the previous summer. Eleanor screamed, pulling both children tightly into her arms, trying to drag them toward the back door. But she wasn't fast enough. The second bullet tore through her back, and Serena felt her mother's body collapse, pressing down on her and Samuel like a final shield. The attackers ransacked the house, searching for something the Hayes family never had. They overturned every drawer, ripped apart every notebook, then vanished into the night as if they had never existed. Serena lay motionless beneath her mother's body, not daring to breathe, not daring to cry, until a deadly silence swallowed the house. She pushed her mother aside, her trembling hand touching Eleanor's face, already cold. Eleanor's eyes were still open, but they saw nothing anymore. Serena turned to look for Samuel, and her heart shattered when she saw him lying beside the dining table, blood pouring from a wound in his stomach. A stray bullet had passed through their mother's body and lodged into him. Samuel was still breathing, but each breath was as fragile as a candle flickering in the wind. Serena crawled to him, lifting his head onto her lap, pressing her hands against the wound even as blood seeped through her fingers. She didn't know who to call. The phone had been smashed, the neighbors were too far away, and her legs couldn't move even for a second away from her brother. Samuel looked at her with eyes full of fear and pain. The 12-year-old boy tried to speak, but only soft groans escaped. Serena held him tight and sang the song their mother used to sing to lull them to sleep, her voice breaking, choking between sobs. She promised him it would be okay, that an ambulance would come, that he would be fine. But no one came. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. Serena felt Samuel's body growing colder in her arms. She tried to keep him awake by telling stories about the future, about how they would grow up, what they would do, the adventures they would share together. Samuel tried to smile, but the smile grew weaker and weaker. By the 4th hour, as dawn began to seep through the shattered window, Samuel squeezed his sister's hand one last time. With the faintest breath, he whispered that she shouldn't be sad, that he loved her, that she had to live for both of them. Then the eyes identical to Serena's slowly closed. His small hand fell limp, and that 12-year-old girl was left completely alone among the bodies of everyone she loved. Serena didn't scream. She didn't cry anymore because her tears had long since run dry. She simply sat there, holding her brother in her arms, staring into nothingness, and a part of her soul died with Samuel that night. When the police finally found them the next morning, it took a long time to pry Serena away from her brother's body. The girl didn't say a word, didn't shed a single tear, her empty eyes fixed on some distant place. And in that fragile heart, a silent vow took shape, that she would never let anyone die in her arms the way Samuel had, that she would learn how to save lives no matter what it cost. After that horrifying night, Serena was sent to St. Agnes Orphanage in the southern part of Chicago. The social workers told her this would be her new home, that she would be cared for and loved, that time would heal all wounds. But they lied. St. Agnes was not a home. It was a prison disguised by white-painted walls and slogans about compassion. The head of the orphanage was a gaunt woman named Margaret, with eyes as cold as steel, who believed that iron discipline was the only way to shape abandoned children. Serena didn't speak to anyone for the first 6 months. She sat in the corner of the room, hugging her knees, staring into empty space with lifeless eyes. The other children thought she was crazy and stayed away. The staff thought she was defiant and punished her. Every time she refused to eat, Margaret would lock her in the pitch-dark storage room in the basement, where rats scurried and the stench of dampness made it hard to breathe. Serena wasn't afraid of the dark. She had seen things far more terrifying than darkness. She sat in the corner of the storage room, closed her eyes, and talked to Samuel as if he were still beside her. She told him about her day, about what she had endured, about how deeply she missed him. It was the only way she could keep herself from losing her mind. At 13 years old, Serena began to draw the attention of a male staff member. His name was Richard, 40 years old, a man who often brought candy to the children and smiled with a look adults called kind. But the way his eyes lingered on Serena made her shudder. The first time he touched her was on a summer night, when everyone else was asleep. Serena fought back, clawed at his face, and screamed. Margaret rushed in, but instead of protecting her, she slapped Serena hard and called her a liar. Richard was her nephew, and no one was allowed to speak ill of her family. Serena was locked in the storage room for 3 days without food as punishment for making false accusations. From that moment on, she learned that no one would protect her, no one would believe her, and she could rely only on herself. She began to plan her escape. She studied the staff schedules, memorized the least used paths, and hid dry food beneath her bed. At 16, on a stormy night, when the entire orphanage lost power, Serena climbed out through the bathroom window and vanished into the darkness. She carried nothing with her except the clothes on her back and a small notebook filled with promises she had written to Samuel. The years that followed were hell in a different form. Serena lived on the streets of Chicago, sleeping under bridges, in abandoned buildings, or anywhere that offered shelter from rain and wind. She ate leftovers from trash bins behind restaurants, begged for spare change at street corners, and sometimes went an entire week without food. Chicago winters were merciless to the homeless. There were nights when Serena thought she would freeze to death, and a part of her even wished it would happen so she could see her parents and Samuel again. The streets were full of predators. A pimp found Serena when she was 17, promising her shelter and food in exchange for obedience. She was smart enough to run before it was too late, but not fast enough to avoid the beating he gave her for daring to refuse. She lay in a dark alley, ribs broken, face covered in blood, and for the first time she thought about ending everything. That night, Serena stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, looking down at the black waters of the Chicago River below. The cold wind tore at her thin body, as if trying to push her over the edge. She thought about her parents, about Samuel, about 17 years of suffering, and wondered if anyone would remember her if she disappeared. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and leaned forward. But at that very moment, a hand grabbed the collar of her jacket and pulled her back. It was an elderly homeless woman named Martha, who had lived beneath that bridge for more than 20 years. She said nothing, only dragged Serena down, held her close, and let her cry until there were no tears left. That night, beside a small fire under the bridge, Martha told Serena about her life, about the losses she had endured, and about why she still chose to live. She said everyone has a purpose, and sometimes that purpose only reveals itself after we have hit rock bottom. Serena looked into the old woman's wrinkled eyes, still glowing with warmth, and she remembered her promise to Samuel. Her brother had begged her to live for both of them. She couldn't betray that promise. From that night on, Serena vowed that she wouldn't just survive. She would live with meaning. She would learn how to save people, the way she couldn't save Samuel. She would turn pain into purpose, loss into strength. And no matter how many times the world turned its back on her, she would never turn her back on those who needed her. While Serena was struggling through her own private hell on the streets of Chicago, The man responsible for all that suffering was sitting on the throne of a criminal empire. Vincent Corsetti was only 21 years old when his father, Don Salvatore Corsetti, was assassinated in a brutal gang war soaked in blood. In a single night, a young man who had just graduated from college was forced to drape himself in a mantle of power he wasn't ready to wear. Other bosses looked at Vincent as easy prey, a child they could swallow whole. They were wrong. Vincent had his mother's eyes but his father's heart. He learned to hide fear behind a cold exterior, learned to turn other people's suspicion into a weapon, and most importantly, learned never to let anyone see his weakness. But no matter how hard he became, Vincent was still a young man swimming among sharks, and he needed a guide. That man was Marco Benedetti, his father's closest advisor, a 60-year-old with silver hair and eyes as deep as ancient wells. Marco told Vincent there was a traitor inside the organization, a rat feeding information to the Vittori gang, the Corsetti family's sworn enemy. Marco placed a file on the desk, bearing the name of an accountant working for a transportation company the Corsetti family used to launder money. Michael Hayes. Marco said Hayes had been seen meeting with Vittori men, that financial documents were leaking, that if they didn't act immediately, the entire empire would collapse. Vincent studied the file, studied the photograph of a middle-aged man with a gentle face and honest eyes. Part of him hesitated, but Marco was the man he trusted most, the man who had carried him in his arms as a child, the man who had taught him everything about the underworld. Vincent signed the death order without asking another question. He didn't pull the trigger himself, didn't look into the victim's eyes. He only put his name on paper and let others do the dirty work. That night, while gunshots echoed through a small suburban house, Vincent sat in his office, drinking whiskey and telling himself this was the price of power. The truth emerged only 3 years later, when Marco died of cancer and left behind a confession letter. Michael Hayes had never been a traitor. He was an innocent accountant framed by Marco to conceal his own crimes. Marco had been selling information to the Vittori for years, and he needed a scapegoat to divert suspicion. Vincent read the letter in silence, then burned it to ashes. He couldn't change the past, couldn't bring the dead back, and revealing the truth would only make him look weak in his enemy's eyes. So he buried the secret deep within himself, along with the guilt and the haunting image of a family he had destroyed because of a lie. In the years that followed, Vincent built his empire on a foundation of blood and tears. He became more ruthless, more distant, and allowed no one near the heart that had turned to stone. Until Isabella appeared. She was the daughter of a legitimate business partner, a 23-year-old woman with hair as black as midnight and a smile that could melt ice. Isabella wasn't afraid of Vincent like everyone else. She looked straight into his eyes and said she saw something different behind the brutality, a pain he was trying to hide. Vincent didn't believe in love, but he believed in Isabella. They married in a small ceremony attended only by those closest to them, and for the first time in years, Vincent thought perhaps he could be redeemed. Isabella brought light into his life, brought him hope for a different future. But fate is never generous to men like Vincent Corsetti. After years of trying, Isabella finally became pregnant. Vincent had never been so happy, never so afraid, and never prayed so much, even though he didn't believe in God. He swore he would protect this child with everything he had, that he wouldn't let anyone harm his family the way he had once harmed another. But he didn't know that blood debts from the past never disappear. They only wait for the right moment to be collected. 15 years have passed since that fateful night, and Serena Hayes is now a 27-year-old woman with eyes far older than her age. She is no longer the frail little girl living under bridges, but life has not become much kinder. Every day of Serena's life begins at 4 a.m, when the alarm rings in the damp basement beneath an abandoned laundromat on the south side. The space is barely 10 square meters, holding only a battered single bed, a small electric burner, and a rusted faucet that drips day and night. Concrete walls are stained with mold. The stench from old sewer pipes rises whenever it rains, and rats sometimes dart across her feet in the dark. Yet this is the only place Serena can call home, a place she pays for by helping Martha, the very woman who saved her on the Michigan Avenue Bridge 10 years earlier. Martha is now 72 years old, her legs no longer steady, and her small laundromat is the only source of income keeping them both alive. Serena's first job each day is as a kitchen helper at a 24-hour diner on the corner, where she washes dishes, mops floors, and sometimes cooks simple meals from 5 a.m. until 11. The pay is small, but she gets one free meal and can bring leftovers home for Martha. In the afternoon, from 1 until 6, she folds clothes and delivers laundry for the shop, pedaling a worn-out bicycle through countless streets to reach customers. And when night falls, Serena puts on the pale blue uniform of a cleaning worker and begins her shift at St. Vincent Hospital, one of the most luxurious private hospitals in Chicago. From 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, she scrubs floors, slipping through empty hallways like a ghost no one notices. Yet it is this job that changes her life in ways she never expected. St. Vincent Hospital is where Serena begins to honor her promise to Samuel. Each night, after finishing an area, she sneaks into hidden corners to watch the doctors at work. She stands outside the emergency room glass, observing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, memorizing every compression and breath. She sits in waiting rooms pretending to watch television while actually listening to doctors discuss cases. She collects old medical textbooks thrown into trash bins, expired journals, and reads them as if they were sacred scripture. The battered notebook she always carries is now thick with messy notes, hand-drawn diagrams of the heart copied from memory, drug dosage calculations overheard in passing, emergency procedures she has watched hundreds of times through glass. Serena knows she can never become a real doctor. She has no money for tuition, no credentials, no one to sponsor her. Still, she studies, she writes, she clings to the hope that one day this knowledge will help her save someone. Serena's health is steadily declining. The congenital heart condition she has had since childhood is growing worse. She often feels sharp pain in her chest, struggles to breathe when climbing stairs, and sometimes coughs up blood late at night. A doctor at a free clinic once told her she needs heart valve replacement surgery, that without treatment she might not live beyond 5 more years. The cost of the operation is more than $200,000, a number Serena doesn't even dare imagine. So she swallows cheap painkillers from the pharmacy, grits her teeth through each wave of pain, and keeps living as if tomorrow doesn't exist. She isn't afraid of dying. She is only afraid of dying before she can do something meaningful, before she can keep her promise to Samuel. That night, as Serena pushes her cleaning cart into the elevator to descend to the basement, she has no idea that just a few floors above her, in the luxurious VIP wing she has never been allowed to enter, the most powerful man in Chicago is preparing to welcome his first child. She has no idea that this man is the one who signed the order that killed her parents 15 years ago, the man who indirectly pushed her into hell, the man fate is arranging for her to meet tonight. Serena looks at the foggy mirror inside the elevator and sees the reflection of a thin woman with sorrowful eyes and pale skin. She doesn't know that this will be the last night she remains invisible, the last night before her life is completely transformed by the weak cry of a newborn child and a miracle she never imagined she could create. At the very same moment Serena was pushing her cleaning cart through the basement, the VIP floor of St. Vincent Hospital was drowning in an atmosphere so tense it was almost suffocating. Vincent Corsetti paced back and forth in front of the delivery room doors like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching, his eyes locked on the wall clock, whose ticking seemed maddeningly slow. 12 bodyguards were stationed along the hallway, their faces expressionless, guns hidden beneath their suits, yet not a single one dared meet their boss's eyes right now. Vincent Corsetti, the man who made all of Chicago tremble, was in this moment nothing more than a husband shaking with fear as he waited for his wife to give birth. Isabella had gone into labor early that morning, but nothing was going according to plan. She was only at the 32nd week of her pregnancy when the pain began, and the doctors had warned that the baby could be in serious danger. Vincent remembered Isabella's eyes that morning as she gripped his hand, the faint smile on her pale lips, her whisper that everything would be all right, that she trusted him, that she loved him. He had promised to stay by her side, but the doctors refused to let him into the delivery room because the situation was too complicated. So he stood there, helpless for the first time in his life, unable to do anything but wait. Isabella's screams echoed through the closed doors, and each cry felt like a knife plunging straight into Vincent's heart. He slammed his fist into the wall, ignoring the startled reactions of his guards and the blood seeping from his knuckles. He didn't pray. He never prayed. But tonight he whispered to whatever force might be listening, begging that his wife and child be spared. 2 hours later, the delivery room doors flew open, and a doctor stepped out, his face drained of all color. Vincent lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and roaring demands for his wife and his child. The doctor trembled, trying to pry Vincent's hand away, and spoke words Vincent couldn't believe were real. Isabella had lost too much blood. They had done everything they could, but they couldn't save her. The baby had been delivered safely, but he was extremely weak due to being born prematurely. Vincent stood frozen, his arms falling limp at his sides, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. He shoved the doctor aside and rushed into the delivery room, only to see Isabella lying motionless on the bed, her black hair spread across the white pillow, her eyes closed forever. Blood still stained the sheets, and the sharp metallic smell in the room made Vincent feel sick. He walked to the bedside, his legs heavy as lead, and dropped to his knees beside his wife's body. He took Isabella's hand, still warm but no longer able to squeeze back, and for the first time in 15 years, Vincent Corsetti cried, not silent tears, but raw, broken screams from a man who had just lost the only reason he had left to live. Outside the room, the bodyguards lowered their heads, none of them daring to witness their powerful boss collapse like a tower stripped of its foundation. The faint cry of a newborn from the adjacent room pulled Vincent back from the edge of despair. He lifted his head, tears still streaming down his face, and remembered that Isabella had left him one final gift. He rose on trembling legs, walked into the neonatal intensive care unit, and saw his son for the first time through the glass of an incubator. Lucas was terrifyingly small, his body weighing less than 2 kilograms, his skin red and wrinkled, his eyes tightly shut, his tiny fingers twitching weakly in the air. Tubes and wires covered the baby's fragile body. Monitors beeped softly in rhythm with a faint heartbeat. The doctor said Lucas would need constant monitoring, that the next 2 weeks would be extremely dangerous, that they would do everything possible but couldn't promise anything. Vincent placed his hand against the glass, staring at the child his wife had traded her life to bring into the world. Through his tear-filled eyes, images of Isabella flooded his mind. Her smile when she learned she was pregnant, her laughter as she chose the name Lucas, her promise that they would be a happy family. Vincent swallowed his tears and whispered to the tiny child inside the incubator that he was sorry he couldn't save his mother, that he wouldn't leave him alone, that he swore on Isabella's soul he would protect him at any cost, even if it meant burning the world to the ground. That night, Vincent didn't leave the hospital. He sat beside the incubator, watching his son struggle through each fragile breath, telling himself that Lucas was all he had left, the only reason he continued to exist. He didn't know that just 2 weeks later, that vow to protect his child at any cost would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable, and that the only person who could save his son would be the orphaned woman scrubbing floors in the basement below. 2 weeks passed like an unending nightmare Vincent couldn't wake from. He barely left the hospital, sleeping on the sofa in the VIP room, his eyes never straying far from the incubator where Lucas was fighting day by day to survive. The doctor said the baby's condition was improving, that his heart rhythm had become more stable, that his lungs were developing well, and that within a few days Lucas might be able to leave the incubator. Vincent allowed himself to hope, a feeling so foreign he had almost forgotten it existed. He hired the best nurses to stay around the clock, summoned leading pediatric specialists from everywhere to monitor his son, and turned the entire VIP floor into an impregnable fortress. That night, the 14th since Lucas was born, Vincent sat beside the incubator and whispered to his son about his mother. He spoke of Isabella's smile, of the way she used to sing lullabies, of the love she had for the child she never had the chance to meet. Lucas seemed to listen, his tiny eyes fluttering open as he looked at his father, and Vincent swore he saw Isabella reflected in those eyes. Everything felt peaceful, until the alarm from the monitor tore the silence apart. Vincent sprang up as if shocked by electricity, staring at the screen as the heart rhythm line became chaotic. Lucas's heart raced unnaturally, then slowed, then stopped completely. A cold, straight line stretched across the dark monitor, and the long, monotonous beep echoed like a death knell. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room within seconds, forcing Vincent back and beginning resuscitation. One doctor performed chest compressions on the tiny body, movements gentle yet precise against the fragile frame. A nurse squeezed the ventilation bag, forcing oxygen into immature lungs. Another administered medication, another adjusted the machines. They worked like a perfectly programmed machine, yet the line on the monitor didn't move. Vincent stood outside the glass, pounding the wall until blood seeped from his fists, screaming for them to save his son, promising he would pay any price, threatening to destroy everything if they let his child die. His bodyguards had to restrain him to keep him from bursting into the room and disrupting the doctors. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Every second stretched like a century, every compression like a hammer striking Vincent's heart. Through the glass he saw the doctors exchange looks, saw their movements slow, saw despair etched clearly on every face. The lead physician finally stopped, looked up at the wall clock, and declared the time of death as 11:47 at night. Vincent heard nothing after those words. He shoved the guards aside, rushed into the room, and gathered his son's tiny body as it grew cold. He called Lucas's name, shook him, begged him to open his eyes, making promises as if words could pull him back from death. But Lucas didn't respond, his eyes sealed shut, his skin fading from red to a lifeless gray. Vincent clutched his son to his chest, bowed his head, and cried as he had never cried before. He had lost Isabella, And now he had lost Lucas, too. He had lost everything. Several dozen meters below, in the hospital basement, Serena was cleaning the storage area when the alarm echoed down from the upper floors. She froze, listening to hurried footsteps, urgent shouts from medical staff, the constant movement of elevators. Something serious was happening above. A critical emergency by the sound of it. Serena tried to resume her work, telling herself it wasn't her place, that she was only a cleaning worker with no right to interfere in medical matters. But the alarm kept sounding, and in her mind, memories from 15 years earlier came rushing back like a flood. She remembered Samuel, remembered holding him for 4 hours in despair, remembered the helplessness of watching life slip away from his body bit by bit. She remembered the vow she had sworn over the graves of her parents and brother, that she would never let anyone die in her arms the way Samuel had. Serena's heart pounded. The familiar pain flared in her chest, but she ignored it. She dropped the mop, stepped out of the storage area, and stood in the empty basement hallway. Part of her urged her to return to work, not to cause trouble, not to involve herself in something beyond her place. But another part, carrying Samuel's voice, whispered that if someone needed her, she couldn't turn away. Serena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change her life forever. She ran toward the stairwell, up toward the upper floors, where the alarm was still screaming like a desperate cry for help. Serena ran up the stairwell, her heart pounding wildly inside her chest, sharp pain flaring with every step, yet she didn't stop. When she reached the 3rd floor, she paused in front of the medical supply storage area she had cleaned hundreds of times before. Inside her mind, years of self-taught knowledge spun like a violent storm. She remembered a medical article she once found discarded in a trash bin about therapeutic hypothermia for newborns suffering from oxygen deprivation. The article said that when the brain is deprived of oxygen, lowering the body's temperature can slow cellular damage and extend the critical window to save a life. The doctors upstairs surely knew this, but perhaps they had given up too soon. Perhaps they believed it was already too late. Serena didn't know if she was right, didn't know whether the self-taught knowledge of a cleaning worker could be trusted, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If nothing was done, the baby would die, and she couldn't allow that to happen. She slipped into the supply room, searching under dim lights until she found the medical ice containers used to preserve test samples and medication. She opened one, stared at the bitter cold ice inside, and hesitated no longer. She dragged the container out, summoned every ounce of strength in her frail body to lift it, and began running toward the elevator. The heavy container pulled her shoulders down, the freezing metal biting into her hands. But Serena clenched her teeth and endured it. She had endured far worse over the past 15 years, and she wasn't about to let physical pain stop her now. The elevator carried her up to the VIP floor, a place she had never been allowed to step foot in during her 2 years working there. When the doors opened, Serena was immediately blocked by 2 massive bodyguards in black suits. They looked at her as if she were a rat that had wandered into a lion's den, contempt in their eyes, hands already moving toward the guns hidden beneath their jackets. One of them barked at her, demanding to know who she was and what she was doing there, ordering her to get out immediately before they called security. Serena didn't back away. She looked straight into their eyes, her voice trembling yet firm, and said she could save the baby. The guards scoffed, and one of them grabbed her arm, preparing to drag her back into the elevator. At that moment, Serena screamed with every bit of strength she had left that she knew how to save the baby, that she begged them to give her one chance, that if nothing was done the baby would truly die. Her scream echoed through the hallway, and Vincent Corsetti heard it. He stepped out of the room, his eyes red and swollen from crying, his face ashen like a man already half dead. He looked at Serena, at the thin girl in a wrinkled cleaning uniform clutching a container of ice, and couldn't understand what she thought she was doing. The bodyguards reported that she was a cleaning worker who had snuck upstairs, that they would take care of it immediately. Vincent raised his hand, signaling them to stop. He stepped in front of Serena, stared directly into her eyes, and asked in a voice hoarse with grief what she thought she could do that the best doctors couldn't. Serena swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice from shaking, and explained the hypothermia method. She said that if the baby's body temperature was lowered immediately, the brain could be protected. The heart might start beating again. She said she wasn't a doctor, only someone who had taught herself, but she begged for one chance. She said that if nothing was done, the baby would die, but if they tried, at least there would be hope. Vincent looked at her in a long, heavy silence, and in that moment, these 2 complete strangers locked eyes for the first time. He didn't see a poor cleaning worker. He saw a fierce fire of determination burning inside those sorrow-filled eyes. And perhaps out of desperation, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose. Vincent nodded and ordered the guards to let her in. Serena didn't waste a single second. She rushed into the room, set the container down, and began to work with trembling yet precise hands. She took out the ice, wrapped it in clean cloths, and carefully placed it around Lucas's tiny body. She positioned ice beneath the neck, along the sides, beneath the legs, creating a cold cocoon around the child. The doctors stood nearby, watching her as if she were insane, but none of them intervened, because Vincent was standing right there, his gaze promising death to anyone who dared interfere. As she worked, Serena whispered to Lucas, her voice soft as breath, telling him not to give up, telling him to come back to his father, telling him she had once lost her brother but she wouldn't lose anyone else again. Tears streamed down her face without her realizing it, and in that moment she was no longer in St. Vincent Hospital. She was back in the night 15 years ago, holding Samuel, begging for a miracle to happen. 1 minute passed in suffocating silence, then 2, then 3. Serena kept adjusting the ice around Lucas's small body, her eyes never leaving the ashen little face. She whispered prayers she didn't even know she still remembered. Words her mother had once taught her back when she was an innocent child untouched by pain. Vincent stood beside her, his hands clenched into fists, every second slicing into his heart like a blade. The doctors watched with doubtful expressions, some shaking their heads in weary disbelief at what they believed was the meaningless effort of a deranged cleaning girl. The lead physician stepped forward, ready to order her to stop, when suddenly the monitor flickered. The cold straight line began to tremble, faint at first like the breath of someone on the edge of death, then stronger, steadier. Lucas's heart started beating again. The rhythmic beeping filled the room, the most miraculous music Vincent had ever heard in his life. He rushed to his son, hardly daring to believe his eyes as Lucas's skin slowly regained color, as the tiny chest rose and fell with each fragile breath. The doctors stood frozen, mouths open, unable to explain what had just happened. The lead physician immediately ordered continued monitoring and temperature control, initiating the professional hypothermia protocol they should have considered earlier. A nurse whispered that it was a miracle, that she had never seen anything like this in 20 years of practice. Vincent turned to find Serena, wanting to thank her, wanting to ask who she was, and how she knew what to do. But he only saw her staggering backward, one hand clutching her chest, her face white as paper. Serena felt the familiar pain explode with greater violence than ever before, as if an invisible hand were crushing her heart. She had endured it since running up the stairs, forcing her broken heart to obey long enough to finish what she started. But her body had reached its limit. The room began to spin, faces blurred, and she saw Vincent rushing toward her with panic etched across his face. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask if the baby was going to be all right, but her lips wouldn't move. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the eyes of that unfamiliar man, eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. Then she fell. Vincent lunged forward and caught Serena before she hit the floor, his arms closing around a frail body so light it felt almost weightless. She was burning with fever, her lips pale, and only then did he notice the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Vincent shouted for doctors, and for the first time in his life, his voice carried real fear for a complete stranger. The doctors rushed in, examined her quickly, and realized Serena was going into acute heart failure. They lifted her onto a gurney and rushed her away amid shouted orders and urgent commands. Vincent stood motionless in the room, watching her disappear through the doors, his hand still remembering the warmth of her body. He didn't know who she was, didn't know her name, didn't understand how a cleaning worker could have the knowledge and courage to do what an entire team of specialists hadn't dared attempt. But he knew she had just saved his son's life, and she had nearly died doing it. Vincent turned to Lucas, now being carefully tended by nurses, the monitor showing a steady heartbeat. Then he looked back at the door through which Serena had been taken. Two people from opposite ends of life, one who had everything and one who had nothing, had crossed paths tonight in a way fate had been arranging for 15 years. Vincent turned to Tony, his closest bodyguard, and gave an order that allowed no argument. Find out everything about that girl, who she is, where she lives, what she does, and make sure she receives the best treatment possible. He didn't understand why he cared so deeply about a stranger, but something in her eyes haunted him, something familiar and painfully unresolved that he couldn't explain. That night, they lay in 2 different hospital rooms within the same building, one fighting to live, and one waiting for answers that would change both of their lives forever. Tony returned the following morning with a thin file in his hands, and an expression that was difficult to read. Vincent was sitting beside Lucas's bed, dark circles under his eyes from a sleepless night, his hand tightly holding the small fingers of his son who was slowly recovering. When Tony entered, Vincent gestured for him to sit and begin his report. What Tony revealed left the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago momentarily stunned. Serena Hayes, 27 years old, no family, no assets, no degrees, nothing at all except 3 part-time jobs and a damp basement beneath an abandoned laundromat on the south side. Tony said that when his men went there to collect her belongings to bring to the hospital, they couldn't believe what they saw. The basement was barely 10 square meters. Walls stained with moisture, water dripping from old pipes, rats scurrying everywhere. All of her possessions fit into a single small bag, a few worn-out sets of clothes, a box of expired painkillers, and 1 notebook. Vincent took the notebook Tony placed on the table and flipped through it, his curiosity growing with every page. This was no ordinary diary. It was a trove of medical knowledge written in slanted yet orderly handwriting, filled with astonishingly detailed hand-drawn anatomical diagrams, drug formulas, emergency procedures, and countless notes in the margins. Some pages were creased and frayed from being read too many times. Others stained with marks Vincent couldn't tell were tears or sweat. On the very first page, Serena had written a single line in red pen, clumsy yet resolute, a reminder to herself that this was a promise to Samuel, that she would learn to save lives, that she would never let anyone die the way he had. Vincent read that line again and again, wondering who Samuel was and what story lay behind those words. Tony continued, saying Serena had been working at this hospital for 2 years, night shifts from 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, her monthly pay barely enough to buy medicine and pay rent on the basement for the laundromat owner. She had no friends, no relatives, no one at all, except a 72-year-old woman named Martha, who lived above the laundromat. Most hospital staff barely remembered her face because she was so quiet, so invisible, like a ghost slipping through the night without leaving a trace. But one detail stood out, something Tony emphasized carefully. Many medical staff recalled seeing her standing outside the emergency room glass for hours, watching doctors work with an intensity as if she were absorbing every movement into her memory. Vincent closed the notebook, set it on the table, and stared out the window in a long, heavy silence. He couldn't understand it. A woman so poor she lived in a rat-infested basement, with a heart condition that could kill her at any moment, had no reason to risk her life for a stranger's child. Yet she did. She had run up multiple flights of stairs with a failing heart, pushed past armed guards, done what the best doctors hadn't dared attempt, and nearly died because of it. Why? Vincent wondered. What did she gain from this? She didn't know who he was, didn't know Lucas was the son of a mafia boss, had no motive beyond the instinct to save a life. He had encountered too many calculating people in his life, people willing to sell their souls for money and power. But this girl was different. The look in her eyes when she gazed at Lucas wasn't the look of someone seeking leverage. It was the look of someone who had lost someone before and couldn't bear to let it happen again. Vincent ordered Tony to ensure Serena received the best treatment possible, no matter the cost, and to post guards outside her hospital room as if she were the most important person in the building. Tony nodded and left, leaving Vincent alone with the notebook and thousands of unanswered questions. He opened it again, turned to the page with Samuel's name, and whispered to himself that he would find out who she was, what her story was, and why fate had brought her to save his son on that very night. 3 days after Serena was taken into intensive care, Vincent received a call from Uncle Marco, the 62-year-old man who had taken over the role of advisor since Marco Benedetti's death. Marco Corsetti was Vincent's father's younger brother, the only person in the family Vincent trusted without reservation, the man who had helped him build his empire over the past 15 years. There was something strange in Marco's voice over the phone, heavy and hesitant, as if he were weighing every word before letting it out. He told Vincent to come to the office immediately, that there was something important about the girl who had saved Lucas, something that couldn't be discussed over the phone. Vincent left Lucas in the care of the nurses and drove to the Corsetti family headquarters on the north side. When he entered the office, Uncle Marco was standing by the window with his back turned, hands clasped behind him as always. On the desk lay a thick file stamped in red with the word confidential. Vincent sat down and asked what could possibly be so important. Marco turned around, his aged face heavy, his eyes looking at Vincent with a sorrow Vincent had never seen before. He walked to the desk, opened the file, and slid it toward Vincent. "This is the complete investigation on Serena Hayes," he said. "And there's something you need to know." Vincent picked up the file, but he didn't need to get past the first page to feel the blood drain from his face. The names Michael and Eleanor Hayes stared back at him, the same names that had been etched into his conscience as his first and most haunting mistake. He didn't need to read the dates or the address. The ghost of that cold December night in 2009 rushed back with a violence that made his hands tremble. Every detail in the report mirrored the nightmare he had tried to bury. The innocent accountant, the crossfire, and the young boy, Samuel, who had died in his sister's arms. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The woman who had just saved his son was the same girl he had left orphaned in the dark 15 years ago. Vincent's heart felt as if it were being crushed. He remembered that day with terrifying clarity. It was the first winter after he took power. The winter when he had signed the execution order for an accountant named Michael Hayes, after being convinced by advisor Marco Benedetti that the man was a spy. Vincent turned the page again and saw a copy of the very execution order he had signed 15 years earlier. His own uneven signature at the bottom right corner. His hands trembled, the file slipped onto the desk, and he looked at Uncle Marco with hollow eyes. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked, his voice hoarse. Marco let out a heavy sigh. "The moment you gave me her name, I recognized the Hayes family. I remember that case because I was the one who opposed the attack. But Marco Benedetti convinced you there was no other choice. I reinvestigated everything, and I found this." He handed Vincent an old yellowed sheet of paper, the confession Marco Benedetti had written before his death. Vincent had burned the original, but he didn't know Benedetti had left a copy in his safe, one that was only opened recently. The confession confirmed that Michael Hayes was not a spy, that he was merely a scapegoat Benedetti used to conceal his own betrayal. Vincent read every line, and with each one, he felt himself sinking deeper into the abyss. He had killed an innocent man. He had killed Serena's parents. He had indirectly killed her brother, the child she had written about in her notebook, the one who died in her arms. He had pushed a 12-year-old girl into hell, forcing her to grow up in an orphanage, wander the streets, and fight a heart condition alone. And that girl, the girl whose life he had destroyed, had appeared 15 years later to save his son's life. Vincent shot to his feet, knocking over the chair, and rushed to the window. He looked down at the city of Chicago stretching beneath him, the city where he had built his empire with the blood and tears of countless people. He thought of Serena, of the sorrow in her eyes when she looked at Lucas, of her trembling voice as she whispered for the baby not to give up. She didn't know. She didn't know the man whose child she had just saved was the one who had killed her family. She didn't know that every day she lived in hell was because of him. She didn't know anything at all, and she was still willing to trade her life to save the son of her enemy. Vincent wanted to scream, to smash something, to turn back time and change everything, but he couldn't. The past had happened. The dead couldn't return, and the guilt he carried now weighed 1,000 times heavier. Uncle Marco placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice gentle yet aching. "What are you going to do now?" Vincent didn't answer right away. He stared into nothingness, and in his mind the image of Serena lying in a hospital bed, with a failing heart blended with the image of a 12-year-old girl holding her dead brother on a rainy night 15 years earlier. He didn't know what he should do, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty, that he owed her a debt that could never be repaid, not even if he burned his entire empire to the ground. Serena woke after 5 days in a coma in the intensive care unit of St. Vincent Hospital. The first thing she saw was a ceiling washed in white light, then the soft glow of medical lamps, then the machines surrounding her bed, and finally a man sitting in a chair by the window, watching her with eyes she couldn't read. Vincent Corsetti. She remembered his name because the nurses had whispered it to one another when they thought she was asleep, saying she was being treated under orders from the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, that her medical bills had likely climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that no one understood why a man like him would care about an invisible cleaning worker. Serena tried to sit up, but her body was so weak that even lifting her arm left her gasping for breath. Vincent stood and stepped closer, his voice low and rough as he told her to rest, that the doctors said she would need at least several weeks to recover. Serena looked at him without fear, without gratitude, only with the exhaustion of someone who had long grown used to facing everything alone. She asked how the baby was, and when Vincent told her Lucas was alive because of her, she only gave a small nod and closed her eyes as if the conversation was over. But Vincent didn't leave. He pulled his chair closer and said he wanted to repay her, that he would cover the full cost of her heart surgery, and that he wanted her to stay at his estate to care for Lucas during his recovery. Serena opened her eyes and looked at him with open suspicion, asking bluntly why. Why would a man like him care about her, someone with nothing? A ghost so invisible even her co-workers barely remembered her face. Vincent didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed the order to kill her parents 15 years earlier, and swallowed the guilt, choking his throat. He said she had saved the most precious thing in his life, that it was a debt he had to repay, and that he wouldn't accept refusal. Serena shook her head, her voice weak but resolute. She said she didn't need anyone's pity, that she had lived alone for 15 years and could keep doing so, that she would take care of herself the way she always had. She tried to sit up, reaching for the IV line to pull it out and leave the bed, but the moment she lifted herself, the familiar pain exploded in her chest. The room spun. The metallic taste of blood flooded her throat, and before she could understand what was happening, she collapsed back onto the mattress. The monitor alarm shrieked. Doctors and nurses rushed in, and Vincent was pushed outside as they fought to stabilize her. He stood behind the glass, watching Serena breathe through an oxygen mask. Her face drained of color, and for the first time in his life felt helpless down to his bones. He had caused all of this. He had pushed her into a life of poverty that left her unable to afford treatment, and now she was slowly dying right in front of him. When Serena woke the second time, the head physician told her plainly that if she didn't undergo heart valve replacement surgery within the next few months, she would die. There was no other option. No miracle that could save her if she continued to refuse treatment. Vincent stood nearby, silent. And when the doctor left, he asked her if she planned to die. Serena looked at him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and for the first time she had no answer. She thought of Martha waiting for her at the laundromat, thought of the promise she had made to Samuel that she hadn't yet fulfilled, and thought of the baby she had saved. At last, she nodded in agreement. Not because she wanted to live in a mafia boss's mansion, but because she didn't want to die before finishing what she had sworn to do. Vincent arranged everything within 2 days. Serena was moved to the Corsetti estate on the North Shore, a vast mansion with dozens of bedrooms and a full household staff. She was given a room larger than the basement she once lived in, with a soft bed, warm blankets, and windows overlooking a lush garden. But Serena felt no gratitude. She treated Vincent with icy distance, answering him in short sentences, never meeting his eyes, avoiding him whenever possible. She didn't know why his presence unsettled her so deeply, only that something in his gaze made her uneasy, as if he were hiding a terrible secret. With Lucas, however, she was entirely different. The baby was brought to the estate once he was strong enough to leave the hospital, and Serena spent most of her time by his side. She sang him to sleep with the songs her mother once sang, told him the stories she used to tell Samuel, and held him with a tenderness she thought she had lost forever. When she looked at Lucas, she didn't see the son of a mafia boss. She saw Samuel, the brother she couldn't save, and she swore she would protect this child with everything she had. 2 weeks passed inside the Corsetti mansion, and Vincent realized that Serena had become an irreplaceable part of Lucas's life without ever trying to be. The baby cried whenever she left the room, slept most peacefully when held in her arms, and seemed to recognize her warmth and her voice more than anyone else in the house. Vincent watched from a distance, noticing the way Serena looked at his son with a gentleness that felt almost unreal, the way she moved with such care, as if Lucas were the most precious treasure in the world. Yet every time Vincent stepped into the room, that softness vanished, her eyes turning cold like a frozen lake in winter. She treated him like a stranger, without hatred but without kindness either, only a distance he didn't know how to cross. That night, Vincent couldn't sleep. Guilt from the past clung to him whenever darkness fell, the faces of the dead returning in his dreams, sleep becoming a luxury he no longer possessed. He stepped into the hallway, intending to go downstairs for a drink, when he heard singing drifting from Lucas's room. The voice was light as breath, sad as an autumn wind, and so beautiful it made him stop. Vincent moved quietly toward the door, staying in the shadows, and looked through the slightly open doorway. Serena was sitting in an armchair beside the crib, holding Lucas and singing him to sleep. The song wasn't in English, but a melody unfamiliar and haunting, perhaps a folk song her mother once sang, every note heavy with longing. Moonlight spilled through the window, bathing her face in silver, and Vincent saw tears rolling down her cheeks. Serena cried as she sang, crying without sobbing, crying as if this was something she did every night when no one was watching. When the song ended, she bent down and kissed Lucas on the forehead, whispering through a breaking voice that she missed Samuel, that she was sorry she hadn't been able to save him, that she wished he were here to see how hard she was trying to keep her promise. She spoke to the sleeping baby as if she were speaking to her brother, saying Lucas was so much like Samuel, with the same round eyes and the same way of gripping her finger in his sleep. She said she would protect Lucas, that she wouldn't let him suffer the way her brother had, even if it cost her everything. Vincent stood outside the door, listening to every word, feeling his heart tear apart. He knew who Samuel was, knew how the boy had died, and knew that he himself had been the one who set it all in motion. But tonight, for the first time, he saw Serena's wound, not through an investigation file, but through real tears, through a broken song, through pain she had buried for 15 years. She too was an orphan. She too had lost the person she loved most. She too lived under the shadow of unbearable memories. In some terrifying way, she and Vincent were alike, both shattered souls trying to piece themselves back together. Vincent stepped away quietly, not letting Serena discover him, and returned to his room with a storm of thoughts. He didn't sleep at all that night, thinking of her voice, her tears, the way she spoke Samuel's name as if the boy were still somewhere nearby. The next morning, Vincent did something he had never done for anyone except Isabella. He went into the kitchen himself, ignoring the private chef who stared at him as if his employer had lost his mind, and prepared breakfast for Serena. Just toast and fried eggs, nothing elaborate, but it was the only way he knew how to show care without words. He carried the tray to her room, set it on the table, and left before she could ask why. Serena looked at the tray, then at the door where Vincent had just disappeared, and for the first time she felt confused. She didn't understand this man, didn't understand why he treated her this way, and didn't understand why her heart beat just a little faster when she thought about the look in his eyes that morning. 1 month passed inside the Corsetti mansion, and everything seemed to be slowly settling into place. Lucas grew stronger each day, began to smile whenever he saw Serena, and the baby's dark eyes always lit up the moment she entered the room. Vincent continued bringing her breakfast every morning, even though she never once said thank you, and he started finding small excuses to be near her more often. Serena noticed the change but said nothing, quietly accepting it the same way she had always accepted everything in her life. But fate never allows peace to last. That night, as Serena was singing Lucas to sleep, his body suddenly burned with an unnatural heat. She placed her hand on his forehead and froze when she felt how dangerously high his temperature was. She called the servants, called Vincent, and within minutes, the entire mansion was jolted awake. Lucas began to convulse, his tiny body shaking uncontrollably, his eyes rolling back as white foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Serena clutched him tightly, trying to keep his head from striking the crib rails, screaming for an ambulance with a voice that tore through the night. Vincent burst into the room, his face drained of color at the sight of his son thrashing in Serena's arms. He took Lucas and ran for the car, not waiting for the driver, getting behind the wheel himself and driving faster than he ever had in his life. Serena sat in the back seat, holding Lucas against her chest, whispering to him not to be afraid, that everything would be all right, that she was here. She didn't realize tears were streaming down her face, didn't realize she was terrified in the same way she had been 15 years earlier, holding Samuel in that fateful, rainy night. St. Vincent Hospital admitted Lucas immediately. The best medical team was summoned, and after hours of testing, the head physician requested a private meeting with Vincent. Serena sat in the hallway, her hands clenched until they turned white, watching through the glass as the doctor spoke to Vincent. She saw his face go pale, saw his eyes turn hollow like a man just sentenced to death, and her heart tightened against her will. When Vincent came out, he didn't look at her, walking straight to the end of the corridor and leaning against the wall, as if his legs could no longer hold him. Serena followed and asked how Lucas was, and Vincent's answer left her frozen. Lucas had bone marrow failure, a rare but extremely dangerous condition in newborns. His bone marrow couldn't produce enough blood cells, and without an urgent transplant within a matter of weeks, Lucas would die. Vincent spoke in a broken voice, saying he had contacted every bone marrow bank in the country without finding a match, that every member of the Corsetti family had been tested with no success, that he had spent millions searching for a donor but found nothing. Serena didn't hesitate for a single second. She told Vincent she wanted to be tested, that she might be compatible, that it had to be tried. Vincent refused immediately, saying she had a heart condition, that donating marrow could kill her, that he wouldn't allow her to risk her life like that. But Serena didn't step back. She looked straight into his eyes and said he had no right to decide for her, that she had nearly died many times in her life and wasn't afraid of dying again, that if she could save Lucas, she would do anything. Vincent wanted to argue, but the look in Serena's eyes silenced him, eyes burning with resolve, eyes of someone who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anyone else. He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he knew she would do it whether he stopped her or not. The test results came back after 24 hours of unbearable waiting, and when the doctor read them aloud, both Vincent and Uncle Marco stood stunned as if struck by lightning. Serena Hayes, a woman with no blood relation whatsoever to the Corsetti family, was the only person in the world whose bone marrow was an almost perfect match for Lucas. The compatibility rate was so high the doctors ran the test twice to be certain, and both times the results were identical. It was something medicine couldn't explain, as if fate itself had placed her here to save this child. Uncle Marco looked at Vincent with a heavy gaze, and in both men's minds the same question echoed. Whether this was a miracle or a reckoning, whether Serena had been born to save the son of the very man who had destroyed her family. Vincent didn't know what to feel: gratitude that his son had a chance to live, or guilt that once again he had to rely on the woman whose life he had ruined. Serena knew nothing of the storm inside their thoughts. She only knew that Lucas could be saved, and that was all that mattered. The night before the scheduled bone marrow transplant, Serena couldn't sleep. She wandered through the Corsetti mansion like a ghost, her aimless footsteps carrying her down long, echoing corridors she had never explored before. She thought about Lucas, about the surgery tomorrow, about the possibility that she might not survive if her fragile heart couldn't withstand the strain. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was only afraid of dying before she could save the child, before she could keep her promise to Samuel. Her steps stopped in front of Vincent's study, a place she knew was forbidden, a room no one was allowed to enter. But tonight, the door wasn't fully closed as it usually was, a narrow crack letting warm yellow light spill into the hallway. Vincent wasn't there, perhaps at the hospital preparing everything for the next day, and his absence felt like a silent invitation. Serena didn't know what compelled her to push the door open and step inside. Maybe curiosity, maybe intuition, or maybe fate guiding her toward a truth she deserved to know. The room was large, lined with bookshelves reaching the ceiling, a solid oak desk positioned at the center. On the desk lay stacks of files in disarray, documents Vincent had reviewed again and again through countless sleepless nights. Serena moved closer, intending to turn away because this wasn't her place, when her eyes accidentally fell on an open file stamped confidential in red. She saw her name, Serena Hayes, highlighted in yellow marker on the first page. Her heart began to race as she picked up the file, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. It was an investigative report about her family, about everything Vincent had uncovered since the night she saved Lucas. She read about her childhood, the orphanage, the years on the streets, and felt violated knowing he had known all of this without ever saying a word to her. But that wasn't what shattered her world. In the final pages, she found a copy of an old document, the paper yellowed with age, the ink faded but still clear enough to read every line. It was an execution order, listing her father's name, Michael Hayes, as the target, and at the bottom right corner, a jagged signature, Vincent Corsetti. Serena dropped the file, papers scattering across the floor, and she stood frozen as if all the blood had been drained from her body. She picked the page back up, read it again and again, hoping she was mistaken, hoping this was a nightmare she would soon wake from. But the words didn't change. Her father's name remained there, and Vincent's signature stood clear like a confession. She read further through the files, finding Marco Benedetti's confession, confirming her father's innocence, finding the report on the attack on the night of December 17th, 2009, and even photographs of the crime scene, her small home splattered with blood. 15 years. 15 years she had lived in hell. 15 years she had wondered who murdered her family. 15 years she had carried pain and hatred toward faceless killers. And the answer had been right in front of her all this time, living under the same roof, bringing her breakfast every morning, looking at her with eyes she now understood were filled with guilt, not care. Vincent Corsetti, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man who signed the order to kill her parents, the man who indirectly sent Samuel to his death, the man who destroyed her life and turned her into a ghost drifting through the streets. Serena didn't know how long she stood there, didn't know when Vincent had returned and was now standing in the doorway staring at her with a face drained of color. She lifted her head, and when their eyes met, no words were needed. They both knew the truth had been exposed. Vincent opened his mouth, about to say something, but Serena didn't give him the chance. She lunged forward, her fist swinging and crashing into his face with every ounce of strength her frail body could gather. Vincent didn't dodge, didn't block. He simply stood there and took the blow, as if it were a punishment he deserved. Serena struck him again, then again, tears streaming down her face as broken screams tore from her throat. She shouted at him that 15 years she had lived in hell because of him. 15 years she had been orphaned because of him. 15 years she had carried the pain of losing Samuel because of him. She screamed that she hated him from the depths of her soul, hated him enough to want to kill him right there. Vincent remained still, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth, making no move to defend himself. He said in a hoarse voice that he knew, that he deserved it, that she could kill him if it would ease her pain. Serena wanted to keep hitting him, wanted to keep screaming, but her body had reached its limit. The familiar pain in her heart exploded with brutal force. Her legs buckled, and before she could understand what was happening, she collapsed onto the cold floor. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was Vincent's eyes filled with anguish and guilt, The eyes of the enemy she had hated for 15 years without knowing his face, and now she didn't know whether she should keep hating him or learn to forgive in order to free herself. Serena woke up in a hospital bed, her body aching as if it had been crushed, yet the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing her soul apart. She lay there staring at the stark white ceiling, letting silent tears soak into the pillow beneath her head. For 15 years she had lived with unanswered questions. For 15 years she had wondered who had taken her family from her. And now that she knew the truth, she felt no relief at all, only a hollow emptiness that reached all the way inside her chest. Vincent Corsetti, the man who had brought her breakfast every morning, the man who had looked at her with eyes she once believed held concern, the man she had almost allowed herself to trust, and also the man who had killed her parents, who had indirectly pushed Samuel toward his death, who had turned her life into hell. She couldn't stay here another second. When night fell and the hospital corridors grew quiet, Serena carefully pulled the intravenous line from her arm, put her clothes back on, and slipped out of the room like a ghost. She took nothing with her except the worn medical notebook, the only thing bound to her promise to Samuel. She moved through the hallway, avoiding the night nurses, and searched for the back exit. She would disappear, return to Martha's damp basement, live out the rest of her days in a dark corner where no one would ever know her name. She didn't need help from her enemy, didn't need the heart surgery he paid for, didn't need anything from hands stained with her family's blood. But as she passed the neonatal intensive care unit, her steps slowed and then stopped. Through the glass, she saw Lucas lying inside the incubator, his tiny body tangled in wires and tubes, his skin pale from lack of blood. The baby was sleeping, yet even in sleep his face was twisted as if in pain. Serena stood there with her hand pressed against the cold glass, her heart tightening until it felt impossible to breathe. Lucas was innocent. The baby knew nothing of what his father had done. He was just a fragile life fighting to survive, just as Samuel had fought on that rainy night 15 years ago. Memories crashed over her like a flood, and she was no longer standing in St. Vincent Hospital but sitting on the blood-stained floor of her childhood home, holding Samuel in her arms, watching her little brother grow colder by the minute. She remembered Samuel's eyes as he looked at her one last time, remembered his voice whispering for her to live for both of them. She remembered the vow she had repeated for 15 years, that she would never let anyone die in her hands the way Samuel had died. And now she was about to break that vow. She was about to abandon an innocent child simply because she hated his father. She was about to become the very thing she despised most. The people who had abandoned Samuel. The people who had arrived too late. The people who had allowed a child to die in pain while no one cared. Serena leaned her forehead against the glass, tears falling without end, and whispered to Samuel as if he were still listening somewhere close. She asked him what she should do, how she could save the son of the man who had destroyed their family, whether he would forgive her if she walked away. And in the soft night air moving through the empty corridor, she seemed to hear Samuel's voice answer, the voice of the 12-year-old boy she still carried in her heart, telling her that Lucas was innocent, that hatred should never fall on the innocent, that if she walked away now she would be no different from those who had abandoned him long ago. Serena straightened, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and looked at Lucas one last time before turning away. But she didn't walk toward the exit. She walked back toward her hospital room, toward the surgery waiting in the morning, toward a decision she knew could cost her life. She wasn't doing this for Vincent. She was doing it for Lucas, for an innocent child like she and Samuel once were. She was doing it for her promise to her brother, because she refused to let another child die when she could save them. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do, even if the one she saved was her enemy's son. As dawn began to break, Serena entered the room where Vincent sat waiting, his face hollow after a sleepless night. She looked at him with eyes as cold as ice, stripped of the gentleness she had shown Lucas, filled only with hatred and contempt. She told him in a flat voice that she would donate her marrow to Lucas, not for him, not for his belated remorse, but because she refused to become someone like him, someone who could let a child die without lifting a hand. Vincent tried to speak, but Serena had already turned away, leaving him alone with a guilt she knew would never be forgiven. News of Vincent Corsetti's vulnerability spread through Chicago's underworld like wildfire. Dante Vittori, the lifelong enemy of the Corsetti family, had waited 15 years for this moment, ever since Vincent seized power and crushed every attempt to overthrow him. Dante knew Vincent was pouring all his attention into his gravely ill son, knew the Corsetti defenses were weaker than they had ever been, and most importantly, he knew about the girl, the mysterious woman Vincent had brought into his mansion and guarded like a priceless treasure. Dante didn't understand the relationship between them, but he didn't need to. All he needed to know was that she was Vincent's weakness, and weakness was meant to be exploited. On the night before the scheduled marrow transplant surgery, Serena was alone in her hospital room, staring out the window and thinking about the day ahead. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was only afraid of dying before Lucas was saved, afraid of breaking her promise to Samuel once again. She didn't hear the door open, didn't see the shadow slip into the room, until a rough hand clamped over her mouth and a needle pierced her neck. The sedative flooded her veins, and the last thing she saw before consciousness faded was the face of a stranger wearing a cruel smile. When Serena woke up, she found herself strapped to an iron chair in a damp basement that reeked of blood and urine. Her wrists were chained to the chair, her legs bound tight, and a rag stuffed into her mouth so she couldn't scream. In front of her sat a man in his 40s with sharp features and eyes as cold as a snake's, lounging in a luxurious chair and holding a glass of red wine that looked like blood. He introduced himself as Dante Vittori, the sworn enemy of Vincent Corsetti, and said he had a few questions for her about Vincent's plans, about weaknesses in the Corsetti security system, and about any information that might help him bring Vincent down. Serena looked at him without a trace of fear, and when the rag was pulled from her mouth so she could answer, she spat straight into his face. She told him she knew nothing about Vincent's plans, knew nothing about the Corsetti family, and even if she did, she wouldn't tell a coward like him. Dante wiped his face, his smile vanishing and replaced by pure rage. He signaled his men, and what followed was a hell Serena had never known, even after 15 years in darkness. They beat her, slapped her, lashed her back with a whip until blood soaked through her thin shirt. They pressed lit cigarettes into her arms, listening to the hiss of burning flesh and the sound of her teeth grinding as she refused to scream. They repeated the same questions over and over, and each time she stayed silent. The torture escalated. Serena didn't talk. Not because of loyalty to Vincent, but because she truly knew nothing. And even if she had known, she wouldn't have given them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had endured worse in her life, had been beaten, abused, discarded like trash, and she had survived. She wouldn't fall to someone like Dante Vittori. In pain so intense, she was close to losing consciousness. Serena thought of Samuel, thought of her brother's eyes as he looked at her one last time, and whispered in her mind that she wouldn't give up. Not ever. Meanwhile, Vincent discovered Serena was missing just hours after she was taken. He stormed into the hospital like a force of nature, roaring at nurses and guards, reviewing security footage and seeing Serena carried away by unknown men. He knew instantly they were Dante's people, knew his enemy had struck where it hurt most while he was weak. Vincent mobilized the entire Corsetti force, hundreds of men unleashed to search for Serena through the night. He personally called every contact he had, threatening, bribing, doing whatever it took to find out where Dante was holding her. Tony asked why she mattered so much, and Vincent answered through clenched teeth that she was the only person who could save his son, and he would kill anyone who dared touch her. But deep down, Vincent knew that wasn't the only reason. He couldn't let Serena die at his enemy's hands, couldn't let her suffer again because of him. He owed her too much, and even if she hated him to the core, he would protect her with his life. After 12 hours of frantic searching, a traitor within the Vittori gang turned on Dante and gave up the address of the basement where Serena was being held. Vincent didn't wait to plan, didn't wait to gather more men. He grabbed a gun and went immediately with Tony and a small group of trusted guards. They stormed Dante's hideout like lethal ghosts, gunfire exploding in the night as enemies fell one by one. Vincent burst into the basement and saw Serena, saw her bound to the chair, her face covered in blood, her clothes torn to reveal raw wounds, yet her eyes still open, still defiant, unbroken. Dante stood behind her with a pistol pressed to her temple, a mad grin on his lips when he saw Vincent. He said that if Vincent took one more step, he would blow his girlfriend's head apart. Vincent stopped, his eyes locked on Serena, and in the brief moment their gazes met, she gave a slight nod, as if telling him to do it, not to worry about her. Vincent understood, and in a split second he raised his gun and fired. The bullet tore through Dante's shoulder, making him stagger and drop the weapon. Before he could react, Vincent lunged forward, knocked him to the ground, and wrapped his bare hands around his enemy's throat. He stared into Dante's eyes, saw the terror of a man about to die, and said this was the price for daring to touch someone who was his. Then he tightened his grip, tighter and tighter, until the light went out in Dante Vittori's eyes, until the lifelong enemy of the Corsetti family was nothing more than a cold corpse on the floor. Vincent stood, walked to Serena, and cut her bonds with hands still stained with enemy blood. He pulled her into his arms, lifted her up, and whispered against her ear that he was sorry, sorry for everything, sorry that she had suffered once again because of him. Serena didn't answer. She was too weak to speak, too broken to move, able only to lie still in the arms of the man she still hated, the man who had just killed the one who tortured her, the man she no longer knew how to feel about at all. Vincent carried Serena out of the death-soaked basement, stepping over the bodies of fallen enemies scattered across the floor without looking back. She was so light that he could barely feel her weight in his arms, the faint breath against his neck, the only proof that she was still alive. Tony had a car waiting at the rear entrance, and Vincent placed Serena in the back seat before sitting beside her and shouting at the driver to get them to St. Vincent Hospital as fast as possible. The car tore through the night like an arrow, ripping through the darkness and leaving behind Dante Vittori's hideout and everything that had happened there. Vincent watched Serena under the passing glow of streetlights, saw the bruises and dried blood on her face, the cigarette burns scattered across her arms, the torn shirt exposing angry red welts across her back. She had endured all of it without a single confession, without a single plea, and he didn't know whether to admire her resilience or hate himself for having pushed her into this nightmare. Serena opened her eyes, clouded by pain and exhaustion, and looked at Vincent with a gaze he couldn't decipher. She tried to speak, her lips moving, but before a sound could form, her body suddenly convulsed. She clutched her chest, her face draining of color in an instant, her breathing turning sharp and frantic as if the air were being pulled from her lungs. Vincent knew immediately it was her heart, the cruel condition that had haunted her for years, choosing the worst possible moment to strike. Panic seized him. He shouted at the driver to go faster, then pulled Serena against him, as if his presence alone could keep her from slipping away. He gripped her hand, the rough hands of a man who had killed without mercy now trembling as they held her icy fingers. He called her name again and again like a desperate prayer, begging her not to die. Not now. Not before he had a chance to atone. Serena looked at him, the light fading from her eyes, yet her pride still intact, unbroken by anything. Her lips trembled as she forced out the last breath she had left, telling him that she owed him nothing, that she wasn't dying because of him and wasn't living for him either, that he shouldn't think himself that important. Each word cut into Vincent like a blade. Yet he didn't let go. He held tighter, staring into her closing eyes, and said through a broken voice that he knew she owed him nothing, that he was the one indebted to her for life, that he didn't deserve her forgiveness or even her gaze, but he begged her to live, not for him, not for Lucas, but for herself, for the promise she had sworn to Samuel, for the dream of becoming a doctor she had written into that worn notebook. He told her that if she hated him that much, then she should live to watch him atone, live to see him kneel before her every day for the rest of his life, live to see him suffer under the weight of his guilt. "Don't die," he whispered. "Don't give him such an easy release." Serena heard every word, and in the pain tearing her chest apart, she didn't know what she felt. She hated him to the bone. Yet his words reached some hidden place inside her failing heart. She thought of Samuel, of her promise, of the medical notebook she had filled over 15 years, and realized she didn't want to die. Not yet. Not before she had finished anything she set out to do. She squeezed Vincent's hand, not in forgiveness, but because she needed something to hold on to so she wouldn't let go. The car slammed through the gates of St. Vincent Hospital at a reckless speed, and Vincent carried Serena into the emergency room, shouting for doctors with a voice that shattered the quiet of the late night. When they placed her on a gurney and rushed her away, Vincent kept hold of her hand until they forced him to release it. He stood alone in the corridor watching her disappear behind the emergency room doors, and for the first time in his life, Vincent Corsetti prayed to a God he didn't believe in, asking only that she live, even if it was just so she could go on hating him. The chief cardiologist met Vincent at 3 a.m. with a grave expression and words no one ever wants to hear. He said Serena needed emergency heart valve replacement surgery immediately, that the heart failure she had just suffered had pushed her to the very edge of death, and that if she wasn't operated on within the next few hours, she wouldn't survive. But that wasn't the worst news. The doctor went on to say that given her current condition, the injuries from the torture combined with a chronic heart disease left untreated for years, her chance of surviving the operation was only 50%. "Half," Vincent whispered, repeating the number as if it were a death sentence. The doctor nodded and added that even if she made it through the heart surgery, she would still need at least a week to recover before she could donate marrow to Lucas, and during that time the baby's condition could worsen at any moment. Vincent stood in the hospital corridor, looking in 2 directions, one toward the operating room where Serena was about to be taken, the other toward the intensive care unit where Lucas lay waiting for marrow to live. His son and the woman who had saved his son were both suspended between life and death, and there was nothing he could do except stand there and wait. Marco came to his side and placed a hand on his shoulder but said nothing, because there were no words that could bring comfort now. Nurses wheeled Serena past on a gurney, and Vincent rushed after them, taking her hand one last time before she was taken into surgery. She was half conscious from medication, but her eyes were open, still looking at him with a gaze he couldn't understand. He wanted to say something, to apologize again, to promise things he didn't even know he could keep. But before he could speak, Serena closed her eyes, and the operating room doors slammed shut in front of him like a wall dividing hope from despair. The hours that followed were the longest of Vincent Corsetti's life. He paced between two rooms, one the operating theater where Serena lay, the other Lucas's room, like a cursed ghost wandering between two worlds to which he belonged nowhere. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't sit down even for a minute. The guards stood nearby, watching their boss with a concern they didn't dare show. They had seen Vincent face enemies without blinking, had seen him order executions without hesitation, but they had never seen him like this, shattered, terrified, and utterly powerless. In the operating room, Serena drifted into a strange dream she couldn't tell was real or just the hallucination of a brain starved of oxygen. She saw herself standing in a vast field of wildflowers, where the sunlight felt gentle like her mother's hand, and the breeze carried the familiar scent of childhood. And in the distance, Samuel was standing there, exactly as she remembered him, 12 years old, with a mischievous smile and eyes just like hers. Her brother ran to her, wrapped his arms around her, and Serena cried as she hadn't cried in 15 years. Cried for longing, for guilt, for everything she had held inside. Samuel wiped her tears away, his smile never fading, and told her she had done well, that she had kept her promise, that she had saved others just as she had sworn. Serena shook her head and said she hadn't finished anything yet, that Lucas was still waiting, that she couldn't die here. Samuel nodded, took her hand, and said that was right. She wasn't allowed to die yet. She still had much to do, many people to save, and he would always be with her, whether she could see him or not. Then he gently pushed her back, telling her to return, to keep living, and that when she had finished everything, he would wait for her there. Serena wanted to hold his hand a little longer, wanted to stay in that field forever, but she felt a powerful pull from behind, dragging her out of the dream and back into painful reality. She woke to the steady beeping of monitors and the harsh white lights of the recovery room. The heart surgery had been successful. Doctors told Vincent that Serena had made it through the most dangerous phase. The new valve was working well, and if there were no complications, she could donate marrow within 5 days. Vincent heard the news and his legs nearly gave out, forcing him to lean against the wall to stay upright. But there was no time to feel relief, because Lucas was still waiting. 5 days of tension passed like 5 years, and when Serena was strong enough for the marrow transplant, she didn't hesitate. She lay on the operating table, staring up at the white ceiling, thinking of Samuel, of his smile in her dream, of the promise she was about to fulfill. The marrow extraction took 3 hours, and when her marrow was transferred into Lucas's body, Vincent and the doctors alike held their breath waiting for a reaction. 1 hour, then 2, then 6, and finally the chief physician emerged with a weary but relieved smile. Lucas's body wasn't rejecting the new marrow. His vital signs were stabilizing, and the baby had crossed back from the brink of death. Vincent stood in the corridor, looking toward the 2 hospital rooms where Serena and Lucas were resting after surgery, and for the first time in weeks, he cried. Not from pain, but from relief, from gratitude, and from an emotion he didn't dare name. 2 weeks after the marrow transplant, Lucas was finally able to open his eyes and cry for milk, like any healthy newborn. His skin had regained its rosy color, his dark eyes lit up whenever he saw familiar faces, and his laughter echoed through the intensive care unit like the most miraculous music imaginable. The doctors said it was a medical miracle, that they had never seen a marrow transplant succeed so perfectly, and that Lucas would grow up as healthy as any other child. Vincent stood beside his son's crib, watching the baby sleep peacefully, silently thanking the woman lying in a hospital room just a few steps away. Serena recovered more slowly than Lucas, because her body had endured too much over the course of her life. The heart surgery, combined with the marrow donation, had drained the last of her strength, and she was confined to bed for nearly 2 weeks before she could even sit up on her own. Throughout that time, she refused to see Vincent, even though he came every day. She asked the nurses to tell him she needed rest, that she didn't want to talk to anyone. But the truth was that she didn't know how to face him. She had fulfilled her promise to Samuel, she had saved Lucas, and now she had no reason left to stay. One morning, when the first light of spring streamed through the hospital window, Serena quietly changed her clothes, gathered the few belongings she owned, and wrote a short letter to Lucas. In it she said she hoped he would grow up healthy and happy, that she would always remember him, and that if there were another life, She hoped they might meet again under different circumstances. She didn't write anything to Vincent because she didn't know what to say. She still hated him, or at least she thought she did. But that hatred no longer burned as fiercely as before. It had become something duller, like an old scar that remained but no longer throbbed with pain when touched. Serena stepped out of her hospital room and walked down the corridor with the slow steps of someone who had narrowly escaped death. She didn't look back, didn't stop outside Lucas's room to see the baby one last time, because she knew that if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. She took the stairs, exited through the main doors, and walked toward the hospital gate, determined to disappear from the Corsetti family's life forever. But she had only taken a few steps when she stopped. Vincent was standing at the gate, waiting for her, as if he had known exactly what she would do. Around him were Tony and dozens of bodyguards, along with a few gardeners and hospital security staff watching with open curiosity. Serena turned as if to leave by another route, but Vincent's voice stopped her. He called her name, not with the commanding tone he used with everyone else, but with the pleading voice of a man who had lost everything. Serena turned back, ready to tell him she didn't want to hear anything, that they had nothing left to say to each other. But before she could speak, something she never could have imagined happened. Vincent Corsetti, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man who had made the entire city tremble, dropped to his knees in front of her in the middle of the hospital courtyard before dozens of stunned witnesses. The bodyguards froze. Tony stared in disbelief, and everyone around them stood motionless as if they couldn't believe their eyes. Vincent knelt on the ground with his head bowed, his voice shaking as he said he was sorry for killing her parents, sorry for stealing her childhood, sorry for indirectly killing Samuel, sorry for the 15 years she had lived in hell. He said he knew no apology could ever make up for it, no action could erase his sins, but he begged her to give him one chance, not to be forgiven, but to atone every day for the rest of his life. Serena stood frozen, staring at the man kneeling at her feet, and felt something shatter inside her chest. For 27 years of her life, she had always been the one kneeling before others, kneeling for food, kneeling for a place to sleep, kneeling for a chance to survive. No one had ever knelt before her. No one had ever considered her important enough to lower themselves like this. And now her enemy, the man who had destroyed her life, was kneeling in broad daylight before the very people he once commanded to live or die, just to ask her for a chance. Tears streamed down Serena's face without her realizing it. She didn't know what to say, what to do, whether to forgive or to turn away and leave. She only stood there, watching Vincent still kneeling, and for the first time in her life, she felt that she had power, that she had worth, that she was something others needed. She didn't know if that was enough to heal wounds this deep, but she knew she couldn't turn away and disappear as she had planned. Not now, not after what had just happened. Serena said nothing after Vincent knelt to apologize before everyone. She simply stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the hospital without looking back. Vincent remained on his knees until Tony helped him stand, and in his eyes there was no disappointment at being rejected, only the patience of a man who knew he deserved to wait. The next day, Serena appeared at the Corsetti villa with a small bag holding a few changes of clothes and her worn medical notebook. She spoke to Vincent in a cold voice, saying she was staying for Lucas, because the baby needed someone to care for him, and she didn't want him to grow up deprived of love the way she had. She made it clear that this didn't mean she forgave him, didn't mean she accepted him, and that he shouldn't misunderstand anything. Vincent nodded, didn't argue, didn't explain, simply accepted her terms, and felt grateful that she had at least given him the chance to be nearby. In the months that followed, the Corsetti villa changed in ways no one could have predicted. Vincent began withdrawing from the family's illegal operations, gradually transferring power to Uncle Marco and trusted associates. He sold off underground casinos, cut ties with smuggling networks, and invested in legitimate businesses like real estate and restaurants. Uncle Marco initially objected, saying the Corsetti family couldn't abandon an empire built over generations. Vincent only replied that he didn't want Lucas to grow up in darkness the way he had, didn't want his son to carry the blood debts he himself had created. And deep down, though he never said it aloud, everyone understood that he wanted to become a man Serena could look in the eye without feeling disgust. The greatest changes came from the smallest things. Vincent learned how to cook, something he had never done in all his 36 years. Every morning he sent the chefs out of the kitchen and prepared meals for Serena with the pitiful clumsiness of a man used to holding a gun rather than a knife. The first breakfasts were disasters. Burnt eggs, scorched bread, coffee so bitter it was undrinkable. But Vincent didn't give up. He watched instructional videos, asked the gardener how to choose fresh vegetables, and patiently tried again and again until her breakfast was no longer an ordeal. Serena never said thank you. but she ate everything he made, and for Vincent that was the greatest reward. As for Serena, she began pursuing the dream she thought had died long ago. Vincent arranged for her to enroll in a pre-medical program at a prestigious university in Chicago and hired tutors to help her make up for the education she had missed during 15 years on the streets. At first, Serena refused, saying she didn't need his help, but Vincent simply said this wasn't a gift, it was a debt he owed, and she deserved it more than anyone in the world. Serena studied with such intensity that she forgot to eat or sleep, as if she were trying to prove to the world that a street child could become a doctor. And every night, when she stayed up late, surrounded by books, Vincent would quietly place a glass of warm milk and a few cookies on her desk and leave without a word. As time passed, the icy walls between them began to melt, not because Serena forgave him, but because she saw the genuine change in Vincent. She saw how he played with Lucas, how patiently he soothed the baby whenever he cried, how he sat for hours beside the crib just to watch him sleep. She saw how he treated the household staff, no longer shouting or issuing commands, but speaking gently and respectfully, as if he were relearning how to be human. And she saw how he looked at her, not with desire or possession, but with the gaze of someone who knew he didn't deserve hope yet couldn't stop himself from feeling it. One autumn night, when Lucas had a mild fever and they both stayed awake to watch over him, they sat side by side in silence, and for the first time Vincent told her about Isabella, about their love, about how she had changed him, and about the pain of losing her. Serena listened without speaking, then told him about her parents, about Samuel, about the beautiful memories before the tragedy. They didn't hold each other, didn't touch. They simply sat there sharing wounds they had never shown anyone. And in that darkness, between Lucas's steady breathing and the cold moonlight outside the window, something began to take root between two shattered souls. Not love, not yet, but the understanding of people who had lost everything and were learning how to live again from the beginning. 1 year had passed since the day Serena decided to stay at the Corsetti villa, and in that time she had changed more than she had in the previous 15 years combined. She had completed the pre-medical program with outstanding grades, been accepted into the most prestigious medical school in Chicago, and begun her first year with the dream of becoming a pediatrician. Lucas had turned 1 year old, toddling unsteadily on his feet and babbling a sound that resembled Mama whenever he saw her, a sound that made her cry every single time, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. Vincent had completely withdrawn from the underworld, handed the empire over to Uncle Marco and trusted associates, and devoted his time to his son and to the woman he didn't dare call his own. But there was one thing Serena had never been able to do in all those 15 years, and that was return to the place where her parents and her brother rested. On a spring afternoon when cherry blossoms bloomed across Chicago, Serena stood before the mirror in her room and told herself that today was the day she had to face the past. She wore a simple white dress, carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums her mother had loved, and drove to Oak Hill Cemetery in the south of the city. She told no one of her plan, not even Vincent, because this was a journey she needed to take alone. The cemetery was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind moving through the trees and distant birdsong. Serena walked along the familiar paths etched deeply into her memory, even though she had never returned since the day her family was buried, and finally stopped before 3 graves lying side by side beneath an ancient oak tree. Michael Hayes, Eleanor Hayes, and Samuel Hayes, names carved into cold stone, the people she loved most resting beneath the earth for 15 years, while she had been too afraid to come because she couldn't face the pain. Serena knelt down, placed the flowers before the graves, and tears streamed down her face without her trying to stop them. She told her father that she missed him, missed the way he taught her to ride a bicycle, missed his laughter whenever she acted spoiled. She told her mother that she was sorry she hadn't come sooner, that she still remembered her scent and the lullabies she used to sing. And she spoke to Samuel, the brother she missed every single moment, telling him she had kept her promise, that she had saved a child, that she was studying to become a doctor just as she had sworn she would. Then she said something she never thought she could say. She said she forgave the man who caused all of this, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved freedom. She said that for 15 years she had lived in hatred, and it had nearly killed her. But now she wanted to truly live, to truly love, to truly be happy in the way her parents and Samuel surely wished for her somewhere beyond this world. She said she didn't forget, would never forget, but she chose to let go, chose to move forward, chose to turn pain into strength instead of letting it continue to destroy her. When Serena stood up and turned around, she saw Vincent standing a few steps away beneath the oak tree, waiting in silence. She didn't know when he had arrived or how much he had heard, but she wasn't angry at his presence the way she thought she would be. Vincent stepped closer, his eyes red as if he too had been crying, and he said nothing, simply standing there and waiting for her next decision. Serena looked at him, at the man who had completely changed in 1 year, the man who had given up an entire empire to atone for her, the man who had waited patiently, without demanding anything, and for the first time, she spoke his name, not with coldness or hatred, but with the softness of a woman opening her heart. "Vincent," she said, just one word, yet it carried everything she couldn't put into language. Vincent trembled when he heard his name from her lips, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He stepped forward, lifted his hand to gently wipe the tears from her cheek, and asked in a whisper if she was sure. Serena didn't answer with words. She rose onto her toes, pressed her lips to his, and gave him her first kiss beneath the oak tree where her family rested. The kiss was as gentle as a breath, salty with tears, yet filled with the promise of a new beginning. And in that moment, within the quiet cemetery and among the ghosts of the past, two shattered souls finally found each other. 3 years after the first kiss beneath the oak tree at Oak Hill Cemetery, Serena Hayes' life had changed in ways the 12-year-old girl she once was would never have dared to dream of. She had graduated from medical school with honors and become a pediatrician at Street Vincent Hospital itself, the very place where everything had begun, where she once scrubbed floors late at night and secretly learned medicine through the glass doors of the emergency room. Now she walked those same hallways in a white coat with a stethoscope around her neck, respected by nurses who called her Dr. Hayes, trusted by parents who placed their children in her care, and loved by gravely ill children because she always knew how to make them smile even on their most painful days. Serena specialized in treating pediatric patients from poor families, children without health insurance, abandoned infants no one wanted to claim. She founded a charity called the Samuel Hayes Foundation to cover medical expenses for cases like these. And Vincent contributed millions of dollars each year to keep it running. He said it was how he atoned to the dead, by saving the living. Vincent and Serena were married on a crisp autumn day, in a small, private ceremony, attended only by those closest to them. There was no press, no curious crowds, just Uncle Marco, Martha, Tony, and a handful of friends they'd gathered over the years. Serena wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the same flowers she once laid at her mother's grave. As she walked toward Vincent beneath a rose arch in the villa's garden, she knew her parents and Samuel were watching from somewhere beyond, smiling. Martha cried through the entire ceremony, saying she never imagined she'd live to see the girl she rescued on Michigan Avenue Bridge all those years ago become such a beautiful, happy bride. 4-year-old Lucas served as the ring bearer, dressed in a tiny suit and holding the rings with adorable seriousness that made everyone laugh. He'd grown into a healthy, mischievous boy, with no trace left of the bone marrow failure that once nearly took his life. Every time Serena watched him run through the garden, she silently thanked fate for giving her the chance to save that fragile little life. Lucas called her Mom, and each time she heard it, her heart warmed as if every suffering of the past had somehow been worth it. One winter evening, with snow falling thickly outside and Lucas fast asleep in his room, Serena sat by the fireplace with Vincent and told him she was pregnant. Vincent froze for a moment, then pulled her into his arms and cried like a child. He asked what she wanted to name the baby, and without hesitation, Serena said that if it was a boy, she wanted to name him Samuel. Vincent nodded, understanding this was how she would keep her brother with her forever, how she would carry the memory of the dead into new life. He promised her that Samuel would grow up loved and protected, that he'd never endure what she and her brother had endured, and that he'd spend the rest of his life making sure of it. Several months later, during a late-night hospital shift, Serena was finishing paperwork in her office when she noticed a small shadow lingering beyond the glass door. She stepped out and found a girl of about 10 huddled in the corner of the hallway, clothes torn, face smudged with dirt, eyes filled with fear mixed with defiance. The girl had run away from an orphanage, was living on the streets, and had slipped into the hospital to escape the cold, just as Serena once had 20 years earlier. Serena looked at the child and saw her own past reflected back at her. The hungry, lonely orphan, the fierce eyes of someone who'd lost everything but refused to break. She sat down beside the girl without questions or lectures, simply handing her a carton of warm milk and a piece of bread. The girl eyed her suspiciously, then grabbed the food and devoured it as if she hadn't eaten in days. When the girl finished, Serena asked if she wanted to become a doctor someday. The girl lifted her head, a fragile spark of hope lighting her eyes, and nodded. That night, Serena called Vincent and told him she wanted to bring the girl into their family, to give her the chance Serena herself never had, to turn the pain of the past into light for the future. Vincent didn't ask a single question. He simply said he'd prepare a room for their new daughter. The next morning, when Serena led the girl by the hand into the Corsetti villa, Lucas came running with a bright smile, shouting that he had a little sister now. Vincent stood in the doorway, looking at his wife with an expression full of love and awe, and Serena knew the circle had finally closed. She had once been an abandoned child, and now she was saving children like herself. She had once lived in darkness, and now she was bringing light to others. Wounds never fully disappear, but they can become the reason we heal others, and that was the legacy Serena Hayes chose to leave behind. Today's story leaves us with a profound lesson that darkness can't drive out darkness, only light can do that. Serena chose to become that light, turning her wounds into a reason to heal others. Sometimes the greatest pain in our lives becomes the strongest force that pushes us to live with deeper meaning. If this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moving story. How did this story make you feel? And what did it remind you of in your own life? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what comes from the deepest part of your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.